What if I told you there was an empire that outlasted Rome by 500 years? An empire that controlled an area the size of Western Europe? An empire that had diplomats in Egypt, allies in North Africa, and trading routes that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea all the way down to the heart of sub-Saharan Africa. An empire that was so powerful, so organized, so sophisticated, that foreign kings sent their sons there to be educated. And yet, right now, most Americans have never heard its name. Not because it was small, not because it was insignificant, but because someone, somewhere, decided it didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. Here is a question I want you to sit with for a moment. When you think of great ancient empires, what comes to mind? Rome, Greece, Egypt, maybe the Mongols, maybe the Ottomans. But what about Africa? Most people picture Africa before colonization as a land of scattered tribes with no real political structure, no written language, no diplomacy, no organized trade. And that image, that deeply embedded, widely accepted image, is not just incomplete. It is a lie. Today, we are going to talk about an empire that most of the world has deliberately forgotten. An empire that sat at the crossroads of the ancient world for over 1,000 years. An empire that shaped trade, religion, politics, and culture across an entire continent. Today, we talk about the Kanem-Bornu Empire. And by the end of this video, I promise you, the way you see African history will never be the same again. Stay with me. This is one of the most remarkable stories never told. To understand why this empire matters, you first need to understand the geography. Picture Africa. Now find the very center of the continent. Not the jungles of the Congo, not the coasts of East or West Africa, but the dead center. The place where the Sahara Desert begins to fade into the African savanna. Right there, at that exact crossroads, sits Lake Chad. Today, Lake Chad is shrinking. Climate change and human activity have reduced it to a fraction of its former size. But 1,000 years ago, Lake Chad was massive. It was a freshwater sea surrounded by fertile land, rich wildlife, and most importantly, people. The region around Lake Chad was not just livable, it was strategic. Think about it this way. If you wanted to travel from North Africa, from Egypt, from Libya, from Tunisia, to the heart of sub-Saharan Africa, you had to cross the Sahara Desert. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. Crossing it without a reliable water source, without food, without a safe place to rest, was a death sentence. But Lake Chad changed everything. The lake sat right in the middle of the trans-Saharan trade routes, like a rest stop in the middle of a highway. Merchants traveling south from North Africa would aim for Lake Chad. Merchants traveling north from Central Africa would do the same. Whoever controlled Lake Chad controlled the trade routes of an entire continent. And for over 1,000 years, that was the Kanem-Bornu Empire. The origins of Kanem are not fully agreed upon by historians, but the dominant account traces the founding of the Kanem state back to around the 9th century AD, the 800s. The people who built this state were called the Zagawa, a nomadic people who had long moved across the central Saharan region. Over time, they settled around Lake Chad and began forming a more organized political structure. The ruling dynasty that would define Kanem for centuries was called the Sayfawa Dynasty. And the Sayfawa Dynasty is one of the longest ruling dynasties in all of human history. They would remain in power for nearly 900 years. 900 years! Think about that for a second. In America, we celebrate a democracy that is less than 250 years old. The Sayfawa Dynasty ruled for nearly 4 times that long. Now, here is something I want you to drop in the comments below. Do you think a dynasty that lasted 900 years deserves to be in our history books? Because right now, most American high school students have never heard of it. Let me know what you think. The early rulers of Kanem were called the Mai, which roughly translates to king or sultan. The Mai was not just a political leader, he was a semi-divine figure. His people believed he had a sacred connection to the spiritual world. His face was sometimes hidden from ordinary citizens. His power was considered absolute. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the kingdom of Kanem was already a functioning state, with a ruling class, a military, a taxation system, and control over the trade routes around Lake Chad. But the real transformation was about to come, and it came in the form of religion. Around the 11th century, Islam began spreading into the Kanem region through trade. Arab and Berber merchants from North Africa were not just bringing goods across the Sahara, they were bringing ideas, language, faith. The Mai of Kanem at the time, a ruler named Humayy ibn Salamna, converted to Islam around 1067 AD. And this was a turning point. Before Islam, Kanem was powerful but regional. After Islam, Kanem became connected to a vast network of Muslim states, scholars, merchants, and diplomats that stretched from West Africa all the way to the Middle East. Islam brought with it Arabic script, which meant that for the first time, Kanem had a written administrative language. Laws could be written down, taxes could be recorded, treaties could be formalized. The empire became more organized, more sophisticated, more powerful. Islamic education flourished. Scholars came to Kanem from across the Muslim world. Mosques were built, schools opened. The empire began producing its own learned class, men who could read, write, argue theology, and advise the Mai on matters of law and governance. And here is something that might surprise you. The Mai of Kanem sent an embassy to the Sultan of Tunis. He maintained diplomatic correspondence with the rulers of Egypt. He was recognized by the major powers of the Islamic world as a legitimate and important ruler. This was not a backwater kingdom. This was a fully functioning, internationally recognized state, right in the heart of Africa, in the 11th century. Let me ask you this, and I genuinely want you to answer in the comments. Did your history class ever tell you that African kingdoms were exchanging diplomatic letters with Egypt and North Africa in the year 1100 AD? Because mine didn't. From the 11th through the 14th centuries, the Kanem Empire entered what historians describe as its golden age. And the engine of this golden age was trade. The trans-Saharan trade routes were the ancient world's version of international commerce. 3 commodities dominated this trade above all others. The first was salt. Salt sounds simple today. You can buy a container of it at any grocery store for less than $1. But in the ancient world, salt was more valuable than gold. Salt preserved food. Salt kept armies alive on long campaigns. Salt was currency. The Sahara Desert contained enormous salt deposits, entire lakes of crystallized salt that sat baking under the desert sun. Kanem controlled access to these deposits and taxed the merchants who extracted and transported them. The second commodity was gold. Gold from West Africa, particularly from the regions of modern-day Mali and Ghana, flowed northward through the Saharan trade routes toward the Mediterranean world. Kanem sat right on this corridor. The empire taxed the gold trade. It protected merchants traveling through its territory. It took a cut of one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. The third commodity was, tragically, enslaved people. The trans-Saharan slave trade was one of the oldest and most sustained slave trades in human history, predating the Atlantic slave trade by centuries. Kanem-Bornu was deeply involved in this trade. The empire conducted raids on neighboring peoples and sold captives northward into the Arab world. This is a dark chapter of the empire's history, and it is important to say clearly, the slave trade caused immense suffering and cannot be minimized. But it is also part of the full, honest history of this empire, and honest history requires us to look at all of it. Between salt, gold, and enslaved people, the Kanem Empire accumulated enormous wealth. The Mai lived in a palace surrounded by courtiers, soldiers, and administrators. The capital city of Nijmi was a hub of commerce and Islamic learning. One of the most remarkable things about Kanem-Bornu is just how well organized it was. This was not a loosely connected collection of villages with a warlord on top. This was a sophisticated administrative state. At the top was the Mai, the supreme ruler, both political and spiritual leader. Below the Mai was a royal council made up of senior nobles, military commanders, and Islamic scholars. These advisors helped govern the empire and could, in times of crisis, influence or even remove a sitting Mai.
The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a regional administrator who reported to the central government. Taxes were collected at the regional level and sent to the capital. The military was organized and disciplined. The Kanem cavalry was feared across the region. Women also held surprising influence in the Kanem-Bornu political structure. The queen mother, called the Magira, held an official position in the royal court and could exercise real political power. This was unusual for a medieval Islamic state and suggests that pre-Islamic traditions of female leadership survived even after conversion. Here is something I think is worth debating, and I want to see this in the comments. Is a state with organized taxation, a standing military, diplomatic relations with foreign powers, and a written administrative language more advanced than European kingdoms of the same era that lacked some of these features? Think about it. Drop your answer below. No empire lasts 1,000 years without facing serious crises, and Kanem faced many. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the empire was destabilized by internal conflicts, struggles within the Sayfawa Dynasty over succession, combined with external pressure from the Bulala people, a rival group to the east. Around 1380 to 1400 AD, the pressure became too great. The Mai and the Sayfawa Dynasty were forced to abandon their original homeland of Kanem, east of Lake Chad, and relocate to the region of Bornu, to the west of the lake.
This could have been the end of the empire. Many states in history have collapsed under far less pressure. But the Sayfawa Dynasty did something remarkable. They rebuilt. In Bornu, they reorganized the military, re-established the trade networks, reasserted control over the Lake Chad region, and within a generation were stronger than ever. By the 15th and 16th centuries, under great rulers like Mai Ali Gaji and later Idris Alooma, the empire, now called Kanem-Bornu, reached perhaps the peak of its power. Mai Idris Alooma, who ruled from approximately 1571 to 1603, is considered one of the greatest rulers in African history. He modernized the military by acquiring firearms, muskets imported from North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. He reformed the legal system based on Islamic law. He built mosques and Islamic schools throughout the empire. He led successful military campaigns in every direction, expanding and securing the empire's borders. Idris Alooma also maintained diplomatic correspondence with the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful states on earth at that time. He exchanged gifts and letters with the Sultan in Istanbul. He was treated as a peer by one of the world's greatest powers. Let me say that again clearly. A ruler in the heart of Africa in the late 1500s was exchanging diplomatic letters with the Ottoman Sultan as an equal, as a peer. But you probably never heard his name in school, and that tells you everything about whose stories get told.
Let us step back from the politics for a moment and talk about what life actually looked like inside the Kanem-Bornu Empire. The capital cities, first Njimi, then Ngazargamu in Bornu, were not small settlements. Ngazargamu at its height is estimated to have had a population of over 100,000 people. That made it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The city had markets filled with goods from across the known world: cotton cloth from West Africa, copper from Central Africa, horses from North Africa, glassware and ceramics from the Arab world. If you walked through the markets of Ngazargamu in the 16th century, you would hear Arabic, Kanuri, Hausa, Berber, and a dozen other languages being spoken by merchants from across 2 continents. Islamic scholarship was deeply embedded in the culture. The empire maintained strong ties with the great centers of Islamic learning: Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the scholarly cities of North Africa. Ngazargamu students traveled to study in Egypt and returned home to teach.
Music, poetry, and oral tradition were also central to the culture. The griots, oral historians, preserved the history and genealogy of the ruling class in the empire. Much of what we know about Ngazargamu today comes from these oral traditions combined with Arabic written records. Agriculture around Lake Chad was productive. The lake and its tributaries supported fishing communities. Cattle herding was common. The empire was largely self-sufficient in food, which allowed it to focus its energy and resources on trade and military affairs.
Every empire eventually declines, and Kanem-Bornu was no exception. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the empire began to weaken. The reasons were multiple and interconnected. The trans-Saharan trade routes, which had been the lifeblood of the empire's wealth, began to shift. European maritime powers, particularly Portugal, Spain, and later Britain, had opened up sea routes along the African coast. It was now cheaper and faster to move goods by sea than across the Sahara. The overland trade that had made Kanem-Bornu rich was slowly bleeding away. At the same time, new regional powers were rising. The House estates to the west were growing stronger. Conflicts with the Tuareg people of the Sahara became more frequent and more costly. Internal divisions within the ruling class also grew. The Sayfawa Dynasty, which had held power for so long, began to fracture. Struggles over succession weakened the central government. Then, in the early 19th century, the final blow came. A reformist Islamic movement led by a scholar named Usman Dan Fodio swept through West and Central Africa, launching what became known as the Fulani Jihad. The Fulani forces attacked and ultimately destroyed much of what remained of the Kanem-Bornu state. In 1808, the ancient capital of Ngazargamu fell to Fulani forces. A capable military leader named Muhammad al-Kanemi rallied resistance, pushed back the Fulani forces, and established a new ruling class. But al-Kanemi's rise effectively ended the 900-year Sayfawa Dynasty. And when European colonizers arrived in the late 19th century, the British, the French, the Germans, all competing for control of Central Africa, they divided the Lake Chad basin between 4 different colonies: Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon. The territory of the ancient Kanem-Bornu Empire was carved up and distributed between 4 separate colonial administrations. Its history was fragmented, its records were scattered, its story was buried. This is the part of the video I really want you to think about. Why is it that a 1,000-year empire, an empire that outlasted Rome, that traded with the Ottomans, that built cities of over 100,000 people, is essentially unknown to most Americans and most Westerners? The answer is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. When European colonial powers took control of Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they needed a justification. They needed a reason why it was acceptable, even noble, to invade, occupy, and exploit an entire continent. The justification they chose was simple. They claimed that Africa had no real history, no real civilization, no empires worth mentioning. Africa was, in their telling, a continent of primitive peoples who had never developed organized society, written language, or political institutions. This was, of course, completely false, but it was useful. If you admit that Africa had a 1,000-year empire with diplomats, scholars, written records, organized taxation, and a standing army, then colonization looks a lot less like a civilizing mission and a lot more like what it actually was: theft. So the history was not just ignored. In many cases, it was actively suppressed. Colonial administrators dismissed African oral histories as myth. European scholars who tried to document African civilizations were marginalized. The curriculum that was taught in schools across the Western world, including American schools, was built on a foundation that treated European history as the default and African history as non-existent. And that curriculum shaped what you and I learned growing up. I want to hear from you in the comments. Did you learn about any African empires in school? Not ancient Egypt. I mean medieval and early modern African kingdoms and empires. Let me know below.
Because I think the answer is going to say a lot. The Kanem-Bornu Empire is gone, but its legacy is still very much alive. The Kanuri people, the ethnic group that formed the core of the empire, still exist today, spread across northeastern Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. They number in the millions. They have preserved their language, their oral traditions, and their sense of historical identity across centuries of disruption.
The region around Lake Chad remains one of the most culturally complex areas in Africa, home to dozens of ethnic groups who share historical connections to the old empire. Islamic scholarship in the region traces its roots directly to the traditions established during the Kanem-Bornu Golden Age. The emphasis on education, legal scholarship, and religious learning that the empire fostered over centuries left a deep imprint on the culture of the entire Lake Chad basin. And there is a growing movement among African historians and scholars to reclaim this history, to demand that the Kanem-Bornu Empire take its rightful place in the global historical conversation, not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as a full chapter, one of the great chapters in the story of human civilization. So let us bring this all the way back to where we started, an empire that lasted over 1,000 years. An empire that outlasted Rome, an empire that sat at the center of transcontinental trade, that produced Islamic scholars, that maintained diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire, that built cities of 100,000 people in the heart of Africa. And most of the world has never heard of it. That is not an accident. That is a choice made by people who needed African history to be invisible in order to justify what they were doing to African people. But history has a way of coming back. The Kanem-Bornu Empire existed. It was real. It was powerful. It was sophisticated. And the fact that it was erased from the mainstream historical record does not diminish what it was. It just tells us something very important about who gets to write history and whose stories get told.
I believe that knowing this history matters, not just for people of African descent. It matters enormously for them, but for all of us, because a more complete picture of human history is a more honest one. And an honest understanding of the past is the only foundation on which we can build a better future. If this video opened your eyes to something you did not know before, I want you to do 3 things. First, leave a comment. Tell me what surprised you most. Tell me what your school taught you about African history. Start the conversation. Second, share this video. Because the only way to fight the erasure of history is to spread the truth further and faster than the erasure can travel. Third, subscribe, because this is just the beginning. There are dozens more stories like this one. Great empires, brilliant rulers, extraordinary civilizations that have been hidden in plain sight, and we are going to find every single one of them. The Kanem-Bornu Empire survived for 1,000 years. The least we can do is remember it.